Hello everyone, my name is Tyra Heckstall, aka Miss Heckstall. I'm a teacher in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I genuinely hope that you all are being safe and staying safe in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, but you are also still being politically and socially aware of everything that is happening in our country. For an example, the string of protests that has happened across American cities, police brutality, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement. In light of all that, I want to educate you all on an event that's not necessarily taught in school or in textbooks. That event is called the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, taking place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. By the end of this video, you will know what caused the massacre and also the effects and how that massacre impacted the African American community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Founded in 1906, Greenwood was developed on Indian territory, the vast area where Native American tribes have been forced to relocate, which encompasses much of modern-day eastern Oklahoma. Some African Americans who have been former slaves of the tribes and subsequently integrated into tribal communities acquired land in Greenwood through the Dawes Act, a U.S. law that gave land to individual Native Americans. By 1921, fueled by oil money, Tulsa was a growing, prosperous city with a population of more than 100,000 people. Tulsa was also a highly segregated city. Most of the city's 10,000 black residents lived in a neighborhood called Greenwood, which included a thriving business district, sometimes referred to as the Black Wall Street. On Greenwood Avenue, there were luxury shops, restaurants, grocery stores, hotels, jewelry and clothing stores, movie theaters, barbershops and salons, a library, pool halls, nightclubs, and offices for doctors, lawyers, and dentists. Greenwood also had its own school system, post office, a savings and loan bank, hospital, and business and taxi service, and they were all black owned. On May 30th, 1921, a young black teenager named Dick Rowland entered an elevator at the Drexel building. At some point after that, the young white elevator operator, Sarah Page, screamed. Rowland fled the scene, the police were called, and the next morning they arrested him. He was ultimately accused of sexually assaulting the elevator operator. When an angry white mob went to the courthouse to demand that the sheriff hand over Rowland, the sheriff refused. A group of about 25 armed black men, including many who were World War I veterans, then went to the courthouse to offer help guarding him. Yet the African Americans of Tulsa were not passive victims. When armed whites congregated at the Tulsa courthouse planning to lynch Rowland, imprisoned for the rape, they were met by a crowd of equally angry blacks determined to prevent the lynching. Mobs of armed white men then descended on Greenwood, looting homes, burning down businesses, and shooting blacks dead on the spot. During the night and day of the riot, deputized whites killed more than 300 African Americans. They looted and burned to the ground 40 square blocks, including 1,265 African American homes, hospitals, schools, churches, and over 150 businesses. White deputies and members of the National Guard arrested and detained 6,000 black Tulsans who were released only upon being vouched for by a white employer or another white citizen. 9,000 African Americans were left homeless and living in tents well into the winter of 1921. In the years to come, as black Tulsans worked to rebuild their ruined homes and businesses, segregation in the city only increased, and Oklahoma's newly established branch of the KKK grew in strength. For decades, there were no public ceremonies, memorials for the dead, or any efforts to commemorate the events of May 31st to June 1st, 1921. The Tulsa newspaper removed the front page story of May 31st that sparked the chaos from its bound volumes, and scholars later discovered that police and state militia archives about the riot were missing as well. As a result, until recently, the Tulsa Race Massacre was rarely mentioned in history books, taught in schools, or even talked about. That concludes your lesson today about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I surely do hope that you've learned a lot, and you can continue to be politically and socially aware. So please stay safe and stay woke.